Good afternoon to all our audience and all protocol observed. Welcome to our on-site and online staff seminar on the ongoing series themed Histories of Contested Spaces, Expropriation, Governance, and Post-Colonial Modernity in Kenya. So today, we have our presenter, Mr. Mathias Hack, who is in front of us, and he is going to talk about tourism for Wananchi, the Africanization of the tourist industry in Kenya after 1966. A brief introduction about Mr. Mathias, who is our PhD candidate in history, studying at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And his background for both bachelor's and master's was the history of European colonization, global tourism after 1945, and post-colonial Eastern Africa. So, Mr. Mathias, we are very keen to listen to what you have for us. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Parita, for the kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here and to present this topic for the first time to a proper Kenyan audience. In many ways, this topic is coming home to the right institution because there's been quite a few people who have produced studies and research about tourism from this very university. What I'm going to present today is very much an unfinished piece of work or a chapter in my dissertation, and things are not as round and polished as I would like them. So please feel free to ask me any question and comment on anything when it's the time. Fitting to travel and tourism, I will take you around Kenya today a little bit. And if we can have the first slide. The next one, yeah. So let me start. On the 15th of December 1972, the Kenyan Minister of Tourism and Wildlife, Jukson Levi Madoka Shaku, attended the opening of the newly constructed Severin Sea Lodge in Bamburi, just north of Mombasa. After touring this new beach hotel, which featured 100 beds, a swimming pool, a big bar, a dining hall, all under Makuti thatched roofs with a green garden area, the minister unveiled a plaque and gave a speech. He thanked the German entrepreneur Rudolf Schulte, who was a majority shareholder in one of Germany's biggest company for electrical household appliances at the time, for injecting capital into Kenya's tourism and contributing to its growth and development. Next slide, please. He then seized the opportunity to, quote, put the record right on a policy statement concerning the Kenyanization of the tourist industry he had made just 3 weeks earlier. I'm quoting, as you are aware, it has been the policy of the government to gradually redistribute the economy to enable the Wananchi to reap maximum benefits. In doing so, a number of measures were introduced. To a large extent, other sectors of the economy have, through these measures, been Kenyanized. But the tourist industry, because of its nature, was not subject to some of the more severe regulations. You will agree that since becoming Minister of Tourism, I have time and again advised the tourist industry to move towards a stage where Kenyans could take their rightful share in the business. As this appeal was not enthusiastically received, I felt it right that positive steps should be taken to ensure that government policy is carried out. End of quote. The measures the Minister Shako was referring to had been announced on the 24th of November the same year in a paper entitled Africanization Policy of the Tourist Industry and included various regulations. First, it was explained that new non-citizen and safari tour operators would not receive new licenses for their vehicles. This was in order to encourage non-citizen tour operators to sell shares to citizens. Second, it was announced that after November 1973, the ministry would not issue new licenses to non-citizen tour guides. Equally, travel agencies would not receive new licenses for their businesses after the end of 1974. If not, 51% of their shares would be held by Kenyan citizens. Next slide, please. The Minister of Wildlife and Tourism had issued this policy statement as an answer to an intense debate in the National Assembly in October 1972, which had come up during a bill regulating the expenditure of his ministry. Various members of parliament had used this opportunity to question and criticize the ministry of not doing enough to secure benefits of tourism to Kenyans. The Assistant Minister of Land, Kibiso, for example, complained that the wealth of the industry, quote, is not spread out to Wananchi of this country, but in fact it is concentrated in the hands of the owners of the Hilton Hotel, the New Stanley Hotel, the Mombasa Beach Hotel, and all the rest of them. Martin Shikuku attacked Jan Mohammed, the Assistant Minister of the Tourism Ministry, as he would not handle tourism in the interest of African Kenyans. I'm quoting, "Who handles this money in the big hotels? Is it not a Mzungu and a Mhindi? Are we benefiting from this industry, Mr. Deputy Speaker? In whose interest is this industry booming? Is it not the white man's interest? How many African tour operators do we have in this country? Almost none. The whole industry is monopolized by Wahindi and Wazungu." End of quote. The Assistant Minister of Education, Rubia, explained in the same session he would be tired of, quote, political uhuru, and he would like to know what specific steps are being taken to, quote, translate this phrase, economic freedom, into action. It is 9 years since uhuru, and we should have converted this industry completely into the hands of Kenya Africans. Otherwise, we are deceiving ourselves, and really, we are not being honest with our people. 9 years of independence, and I cannot recall one African company of any substance. End of quote. This debate and the pressure on the MTV, on the Ministry of Tourism, had contributed to the aforementioned new regulations, which were drastic and sudden for the tourist industry. It was for that reason that Shako made sure during the opening ceremony of the Severan Sea Lodge to mention in his speech that Kenya's tourism development policy would welcome foreign investment and encourage local participation and benefits to Kenyans at the same time. The tourist industry, which in fact was largely owned by multinational corporations and Kenyans of European and African and Asian descent, reacted cautiously and defensive. Their representative organization, the Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers, called for the establishment of a tourism council in early December 1972 to better the communication between them and the government. Next slide, please. The editor of the magazine Safari, this is the magazine was always close to the tourist industry, advised the ministry to move gradually with Kenyanization. While no one, the editor wrote, quote, will quarrel with the desire to see that Kenya reaps maximum cash benefits from its tourist attractions, the tourism industry cannot be treated for localization purposes like, say, a butcher shop, end of quote. He claimed the businesses were the ones actually driving Kenya's tourism under tremendous international competition and high promotion costs abroad, and stated it would take the largely unexperienced Kenyan Africans many years to rise to this level of expertise. And he concluded, quote, "It is therefore foolish to denigrate the role which non-citizen companies are playing in this sphere." End of quote. Next slide, please. These examples, which I have listed here again, mark an intensified period of discussion and action about the Africanization or Kenyanization of the tourist industry in independent Kenya. It showcases the participants and stakeholders, the patterns and features which are fitting to the overall discourse, which could be roughly placed between 1965 and 1985. In certain intervals, public and political pressure to implement Kenyanization boiled up and forced the government in form of the Ministry of Tourism to react, calling on the industry to sell shares, hire more African Kenyans as managers, warning the industry that regulations could be stepped up, or simply telling hoteliers to do more for the country were the common answers of the Ministry of Tourism to relieve some of the pressure. The tourist industry usually reacted with concerns that a rapid Kenyanization would endanger foreign investment and harm tourist development, which in turn would harm the Kenyan economy. Comments about race and belonging of Kenyan, of African, European, or Asian descent underlined the discussion frequently. While official government papers would only use the term Kenyanization, Africanization was used in public and informal forums, as well as the terms of indigenization or nationalization. Over the 20-year period between 1965 and 85, the Kenyan government implemented and introduced several measures to Kenyanize the industry, although a distinct policy was never formulated or its steps and goals precisely outlined. In my presentation today, I want to dive down a little bit deeper into the plans, debates, and measures surrounding the Africanization or Kenyanization of what became Kenya's second biggest industry after agriculture in the late 1960s. I will first outline how this presentation fits into the overall concept of my dissertation about the touristification of Kenya between the mid-1960s and late 1990s. This part will hopefully also give you some more information about the history and historiography of tourism in Kenya. After that, I want to zoom in on the question of how white and foreign the tourist industry after independence actually was. The centerpiece of this presentation is then concerned with how Africanization was debated and implemented. I will try to show how the Africanization of the industry aligned and competed with tourist development goals, and how the establishment of two institutions, the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation and Kenya Utalii College, aided Africanization. Together, these two institutions were set up to implement and drive Kenyanization. In the third part, I want to show how the tourist industry cooperated and resisted several measures of Kenyanization by looking at a few examples of different companies. As I have done several oral history interviews with the first generation of African Kenyan hotel managers, if you want, the beneficiaries of the Africanization policies, I will include their experiences within the presentation. And then finally, I will give you some conclusions and try to evaluate the success of these tourist industries' Africanization. Next slide. First, to my dissertation overall, it holds the project title Touristifying Kenya. I'm asking the very basic but fundamental question, who touristified Kenya and why between the mid-1960s and late 1990s? The term touristification is a rather loose concept in scientific literature and research, and is usually applied to describe a strong and mostly negative impact of tourism on economic, environmental, cultural, and social conditions of a spatial entity like a city or a beach or a national park. While the focus of tourism as a space shaping and space making and power has been proven productive, much of the research and studies on touristification is narrowly focused on specific short time periods, small spatial entities, and single group of actors. Long-term historical processes, established travel patterns or leisure traditions, and contemporary ideologies or political regimes impacting and driving tourism are therefore often out of sight. By considering Kenya both a stage and a product of touristification, I aim to highlight the cooperation, conflict, convictions, and contradictions between several groups of actors who made, developed, promoted, criticized, and sold Kenya as a tourist destination. My preliminary table of content, which you can see here, gives you a rough idea of how I'm trying to do this in 6 chapters. The first chapter deals with the relationship between colonialism and tourism. For the colonial authorities in Kenya, Kenya's white settler community, and the tourist entrepreneurs, tourism was both an economic and a political or ideological project. From the first decade of the 20th century onwards, luxurious hunting safaris and photo safaris, which had a breakthrough in the 1950s, provided good financial returns to the colonial economy. At the same time, wildlife tourism portrayed Kenya as a safe, readily available, and enjoyable playground for privileged upper-class white men. Kenya was a famed hunting destination in what John Mackenzie has described as the empire of travel, where a white hunter or photographer could prove his alleged superiority over people and domesticated wild nature. Tourism did not interfere with the colonial racist structures, but rather enacted them, as white tourists would be accompanied and cared for by black servants, gun bearers, or drivers. It was no surprise that the official promotion of tourism through a body like the East African Tourist and Travel Association was intensified during the atrocities of the Mau Mau emergency. By portraying Kenya as a peaceful and exotic holiday destination, colonial authorities could deflect criticism and showcase supposedly positive effects of British rule. The 1950s were also the high time of late colonial developmentalism, which carried its momentum into independent Kenya. Through a flurry of studies, developmentalists, scientists, policy advisors, or tourist entrepreneurs advocated to conceive tourism as a central motor for the economic development of the Kenya colony and the independent Republic of Kenya. Planning and scheming would ultimately reach its height in the mid-1970s with the Diani Resort Complex. Next slide, sorry. Planners proposed a gigantic complete holiday destination in the Diani region south of Mombasa, with several hotels of different classes, an environmental green zone which would have reshaped the nature in the area, and a new town for the employees with educational, welfare, and social facilities. Next slide. The scheme was to be developed in 3 stages until the year 2000, would provide 6,000 hotel beds and nearly 12,000 jobs, and was considered to cost around 910 million Kenya shilling. As with many development projects of the time, it was never realized, but exemplified the enormous faith into both tourism and developmental planning. The Diani Resort Complex also aimed for maximum Kenyan involvement, as it stated, meaning Kenyans should own, manage, work in the resort, and enjoy it as tourists themselves. By including measures and debates on Africanization or Kenyanization in my dissertation, I aim to show how the Kenyan government tried to make tourism viable for its own citizen, touristifying Kenya for the good of Wananchi. Next slide, please. After these first 3 chapters in my dissertation, which are focused more on ideologies or political programs shaping tourism, the second part of the dissertation is here 5 to 7, then detailed the 3 main forms tourism took between the mid-1960s and late 1990s. Some of the first generation of African hotel managers call this time period the beach and safari era. Conservationists had convinced the late colonial government and the upcoming government of independent Kenya in the 1950s or early 1960s that tourism would be the best and most lucrative form of land use in the many national parks and game reserves. Nature and wildlife were to be touristified in order to conserve them. Tourism served as the economic underbelly and legitimation of conservation. After the Ministry of Tourism was established in 1966, it funded several Kenya tourist offices abroad, first in New York, Paris, London, and Frankfurt, and promoted Kenya first as safari land. The most common form of holiday to Kenya in this whole time period of my dissertation was a package tour of roughly 3 weeks with 1 week of safari and 2 weeks at the beach. This indicates how important beach tourism was for Kenya until the late 1990s. By the mid-1970s, beach tourism had overtaken safari tourism both in size and revenue generation. Especially European, German-speaking, British, Italian, and French tourists came to the Kenyan coast in massive numbers and as repeater tourists. Next slide, please. The Swiss African Safari Club was the largest hotel company in Kenya between the late 70s and early 90s, holding more than 40% of all beds along the coast. This chapter on beach tourism is probably the one most based in the economic incentive tourism provided, and it therefore asks for the reasons and strategies how international and local tourist corporations touristified Kenya's coastline against the number of interchangeable beach destinations across the world. The last chapter of my dissertation then deals with what could be called colonial nostalgia tourism. Although the myth of the white man's country, Happy Valley, or generally the romantic depictions of Kenya's white settler colonialism had been used as attractions in colonial-style hotels such as the Norfolk, just outside the door, Outspan and Treetops after independence, growing nostalgia in Great Britain in the early 1980s led to renewed interest in Kenya's colonial past. The 1985 film Out of Africa, based on Karen Blixen's autobiographic novel, presented a distorted, romanticized fiction of colonial Kenya to the world and resulted in an enormous interest into Kenya, or more precisely, into colonial Kenya. Tour operators eagerly transformed this interest into Karen Blixen-style safaris, Ernest Hemingway tours, and many other features. Many of the descendants of Kenya's white settler community, already active in the tourist industry, eagerly embraced this form of tourism as it allowed them to shape a specific imagination of their Kenya. Maybe you can go back one slide. By combining these 6 chapters, I hope to offer a comprehensive picture. of how and why colonial and post-colonial governments, developmental economists and scientists, conservationists, local tourist entrepreneurs and international tourist corporations, and lastly, the tourists themselves made and shaped what is Kenya as a tourist destination, or maybe even what is Kenya overall. Kenya provides a unique case study for such a project on touristification because it was essentialized as a colonial tourist destination, probably one of the most successful in sub-Saharan Africa. And its post-independence government embraced mass tourism on a large scale. Can go forward 2 slides. Here you can see a rough estimate of how tourist numbers grew after independence. In the 1960s, there's a growth rates of 10 to 15%. Then there's a slowdown because of the oil crisis, and the East African community fell apart in 1977. And then you see a big spike again in the 1980s, it nearly doubled, and once again in the 2000s. So this is kind of the growth pattern. Between 1970 and the early 1990s, Kenya received between 5 to 10% of all tourists to the African continent. And its only rival in sub-Saharan Africa was apartheid South Africa. Its uniqueness as a former white settler colony, safari and beach destination, an epicenter of conservation, the site of the first hotel management school in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the huge economic dependency Kenya developed on tourism, make it a rich and worthwhile case study. There's also a need for an intensification on historical studies on tourism, as until now there have only been a small number of studies and articles. Next slide, please. Among those are Trevor Simmons' dissertation, Selling the African Wilds, which is an economic study of the colonial tourist industry, and Devin Smart's article, Safariland, about how Kenya promoted itself after independence. But moving beyond the colonial and colonization era, there's virtually no more historical research on tourism. Nina Berman and Vanjoy Kibichu have both worked on tourism at the coast and more specifically on sex and romance tourism, but their books have very little historical depth. What has been Kenya's biggest generator of foreign exchange revenue of the second part of the 20th century, the sector with the biggest number of wage employees, an enormous contact zone between the world and Kenya, and a huge transformation force for Kenya's coast and many other places, remains widely understudied. I'm saying this not because this results in a few problems to my research. There's very little available research I can draw from, and this includes very basic data that you need, for example, tourist numbers, existing hotels, a collection of decisive laws, or even a list of tourism ministers. This is why this project has taken me much longer than I expected, and I have some difficulties with that basic material. I'm not saying this to complain, but just for you to know that I might not have a precise answer on some of your questions, but rather an assumption. But let me now come to the essential part of this presentation. Next slide. At independence in 1963, Kenya's tourist industry was white and foreign. Owners and managers of hotels and tour companies were white Kenyans of European descent, expatriates from Europe, and so were their guests. A survey by a Swiss consultancy company, this is the one here, found that in 1968, there was no Kenyan of African origin among the 180 general managers of the hotels in the country, and only a handful of African assistant managers. The Assistant Minister of Tourism and Wildlife, Jan Mohammed, explained in the same year in an article in the East African Standard that 80% of the tourist trade would be in foreign hands. And only one hotel and 2 tour operators were owned fully by Kenyans of African origin. The biggest and most well-known Kenyan hotel company at the time was Block Hotels, owned by the Kenyan Jewish Block family. With the Norfolk, New Stanley, Outspan, Treetops, Nyali Beach, and several lodges across the country, the company owned the most prestigious and lucrative hotels. Steve Mutua, who joined the company's head offices in 1975, told me in an interview that he was the second African Kenyan starting to work in the company on a lower management position. Colonial labor laws, the accumulation of capital by white settlers, and the racist policies and business practices had barred Kenyans of African descent from entering the tourist industry, both as entrepreneurs and in leadership positions. Due to its high demand of service labor, roughly 0.8 workers per hotel bed at the time, the industry was actually comprised of 98% African Kenyan workers against the backdrop of roughly 1.5 to 2% white employees and several Kenyans of Asian descent. Trevor Simmons described Africans as the backbone of the tourist industry in the colonial era, and their roles remained essentially the same after independence. As unskilled or semi-skilled laborers, they worked as cleaners, waiters, room stewards, drivers, kitchen helpers, gardeners, and souvenir sellers. In an article in the Daily Nation in 1972, the then Minister for Tourism, Shako, said the tourist industry was suffering from a colonial hangover, which reenacted colonial master-servant relationships between the white tourists and the black personnel. In the Africanization policy statement, which I have mentioned in the beginning, he explained that although 95 non-citizen tour operators were numerically nearly matched by 82 citizen tour operators, a small number of the former would regulate nearly 90% of the business. It was still common in several hotels in the mid-1970s to not allow any black customers on their premises. Many hotels and lodges, furthermore, did not allow service personnel like drivers of safari vehicles from tour operators to share a drink with their clients in the bar. While precise numbers on the topic of ownership and management are hard to come by, the discontent about the largely white and foreign industry can regularly be found in the National Assembly and across the media landscape, especially in the late 60s and early 70s. Journalists and politicians alike especially pointed towards the fact that Kenyans seem to benefit only marginally from tourism. Next slide, please. The Assistant Minister for Health, Mohamed Jahazi, compared the issue of tourism with that of the hotly debated ownership of land and farms in the country during a debate in February 1970. I'm quoting here. We should not be faced with the problem with when many European farmers had all the farms and we had to buy them out. We found that each of them had acres and acres of land. So I would like to see more local participation and all the plans we have geared for eventual takeover by the local people. That is when we will actually benefit from tourism. Otherwise, at the moment, apart from a few waiters in the hotels and drivers, very few local people benefit from tourism. The call for participation in ownership, spread of financial benefits, possibilities of careers in the industry was frequently and loudly directed to the government. Africanizing the tourist industry faced the same issues that Donald Rothschild has outlined for other private sectors of the Kenyan economy in an article in 1970 already. A rapid procedure would harm the economic development goals of the country and would therefore have to be aligned with it. The Pan-African activist T. Ras McConan, who worked in the Kenyan Ministry of Tourism in the late 1960s, conceived that Africanizing a developing industry of enormous economic importance like tourism faced a dilemma. Next slide, please. Oh, I think it was the last slide, actually. So you can go back one. During a seminar in a tourism week, during the tourism week in 1969, he outlined, quote, since most African states are newly emerged from the thralls of colonialism, and since under colonialism, their business and industry were under the control of foreign nationals, it would obviously be to the advantage of those states to seek to eliminate foreign influences in these spheres. The realities of the situation, however, are that these African states do need foreign capital for their own development programs, and consequently, invitation to foreign investors and even skills continues to be the order of the day. A disadvantage of tourism, therefore, is that it can become the victim of the internal contradiction of the Africanization policy of given African states. End of quote. Whereas several foreign developmental experts did not include Africanization in great detail, neither positively nor negatively, in around 20 different developmental studies that were produced on tourism in Kenya between 1960 and 80, Africanization featured prominently in the national development plans. Both the second and third national development plan stated a twin objective of maximizing foreign exchange revenue through tourism and efforts to Kenyanize the industry. Besides using licenses and regulations like the 51% rule I've mentioned in the beginning, the Kenyan government set up two institutions to implement Kenyanization. While the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation was envisioned to undertake a major role in financing, constructing, and managing hotels and lodges, a hotel training school, which would ultimately become the Kenya Utalii College, was to deal with the shortage of skilled labor for tourism. In early 1969, a provisional hotel training school with first 19 students was integrated into the Kenya Polytechnic School, financed by Swiss development aid. It should be noted that both of these institutions primarily served development goals, which not always aligned with Africanization efforts and at times contradicted them. In the interest of time, I will only give a brief overview of what the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation and the Kenya Utalii College looked like and did to increase Kenyan or African participation in the industry. According to Rosemary Yomo, who evaluated indigenous enterprises in the tourist industry in the 1980s, the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation had four main tasks. First, it pursued commercial interests of the government in the tourist industry by buying shares in hotels, developing, constructing, and managing lodges. Secondly, it pushed the Africanization of the sector by third, providing loans and expertise for African Kenyans entering the industry. And fourth, it pioneered tourism in regions the private sector would not go due to high costs. After its establishment in 1965 to around 1970, the KTDC, I'm using the shortcut now, mostly bought shares in hotels set up by multinational corporations like the Hilton here in Nairobi or the Pan Africa Hotel, or in tour operators like the flying safari operator Vulcan Air, and developed lodges like the Voi Safari Lodge and Anguilla Safari Lodge, together with other international shareholders. Most of these projects of the KTDC in the early days were much more driven by commercial interests and aimed at securing revenue and interest of the Kenyan state in the private tourism sector. In April 1970, the then tourism minister Shako dismissed the first chairman of KTDC and ordered his assistant minister to come up with a clearly defined investment policy for the parastatal organization. I cannot say that the KTDC had a completely turnover after this, but as it continued to buy and hold shares in multinational corporations, but there was an increased focus on providing loans and cooperate with local corporations. Therefore, the corporation aligned itself more with its Africanization policies. Next slide. The KTDC, for example, we go back one. It's one back here. Just this one. 16. 16? Yeah. This is the KTDC, for example, funded and supported projects like the Ark, a luxury game viewing lodge in the Aberdares. Opened in 1970, the lodge had 9 African Kenyan shareholders, while the KTDC was one of the biggest with 21% equity. In the early 1970s, the corporation started to cooperate with the Industrial Promotion Service, which was an investment group by Aga Khan, to set up the Serena Hotel Group, where it would become a major shareholder as well. Within the budget of 59 million Kenya shilling, the third national development plan gave for all tourist activities, the KTDC was equipped with 10 million Kenya shilling. With 9 million Kenya shilling, it bought shares to avoid a concentration of tourist enterprises in, quote, a minority of wealthy persons, both citizens and non-citizen, and the remaining 1 million shilling were to provide loans like this one to hoteliers and tour operators with favorable rates and durations for up to 20 years. Such loans, for example, were granted to Kasim Laka and his partners who owned the small Ocean View beach cottages. His application to the corporation in June 1970 stated that he would require £32,000 to modernize and extend his lodge to 82 beds. As his hotel had contracts with big tour operators, big European tour operators, the KTDC Council approved it. Sorry. Joint ventures with local councils in rural areas to open lodges were also common. In 1978, the Murang'a County Council, Kenya Tourist Development Corporation, and a group of private investors debated opening a lodge in the Aberdare Mountains at Kariaka-Mbari, Yangware. The decision-making process usually comprised various meetings between the stakeholders and sending a delegation of the development corporation to assess the site. Sorry, I just need to drink something. Okay. So the decision-making process usually comprised various meetings between the stakeholders and sending a delegation of the corporation to assess the site. The report in the case of this lodge noted abundant game and good viewing opportunities in the area, but saw the need for the construction of an all-weather road and better electricity supply for the lodge. To finalize the application, the Tourist Corporation also decided that the game in the area should be counted to assure it would be enough to please potential tourists. So these are just two examples of how the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation tried to assist in the sector. By taking over the majority shares of a company called African Tours and Hotels in 1976, the KTDC took a next step in acquiring a management company which would run several hotels and lodges the KTDC owned or had shares in. This company specifically targeted Wananchi as customers and aimed to push domestic tourism. I'm quoting from an advertisement of this company. African Tours and Hotels, in accordance with its policy of taking tourism to Wananchi, would like to encourage more groups of people, and in particular school children, to see some of the places upcountry, which, being very popular, are normally fully booked by tourists, but are being made available to locals now on special requests. So these are some impressions of the portfolio of the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation. I'm still a bit unsure of how many hotels and lodges the KTDC actually owned and managed. Generally spoken, the KTDC held shares in the private sector, mostly in high-end international tourist class hotels, and managed a public sector with lower and medium class hotels, which were geared towards a lower income Kenyan African clientele. I think there's around 20 to 25 hotels that fall into that category. The KTDC still exists today as a parastatal company investing into tourism projects. Now let's switch to the other Kenya Utalii College. Similar to the establishment of KTDC, the decision to establish a tourism institution for training derived much more from developmental goals than from Africanization policies. The study of the Swiss consultancy firm I've already mentioned stated in December 1968, Kenya would require 1,500 additional workers annually, nearly 300 of them specially trained as managers and heads of department, if the intended growth until 1973 should be realized. The consultancy therefore advised for the establishment of a hotel training school to ease the need for skilled workers and to avoid tension, which could be caused by keeping Kenyan Africans out of managing positions. Next slide, please. In early 1969, the ministry and the Swiss Department for Technical Aid, represented by a consultative firm called Tourist Consult, agreed on the establishment of a provisional hotel training school at Nairobi Polytechnic. This is one of the very first students you can see over there. Next slide, please. In 1972, a final agreement about the construction of a full training college was agreed on, and in 1975, Kenya Utalii College opened its doors for the admission of up to 500 students annually. This is President Kenyatta officially opening Kenya Utalii College in June 1976. The editor of the Daily Nation described the opening of KUC in 1975 as closing a gap in Kenya's tourism and will not allow companies to further discriminate against local people. Quoting, "It is a realistic dream that within the foreseeable future, Kenya's tourist industry will be handled entirely by local people who will be able to inject new ideas and vigor into it so it can continue to flourish." End of quote. The training college was probably the biggest and most ambitious project undertaken to train Kenyans to work in the tourist industry. Initially funded by 12 million Swiss francs, a training levy of 2% from total sales of all hotels and restaurants in Kenya was set up to finance the running of the institution. The college initially offered various certificates for front office, food production, food and beverages, service and sales, housekeeping and laundry, which could be done in 2 years, and a hotel management course, which lasted 4 years. Every student signed up to study a language In the beginning, German and French were offered. All programs were tuition-free until 1982 and included so-called familiarization programs and industry attachments. Within the first weeks at the school, all students first went to hotels in and around Nairobi to work in basic positions such as waiters, cleaners, and room stewards. Throughout the 4 years, hotel management students then regularly went to work as an intern in hotels to gain practical experience. The college ground here in Mathare and Nairobi had sport and teaching facilities, dorm rooms, a show and practice kitchen, as well as a training hotel next to it, the Utalii Hotel, where the students regularly worked to gain further experiences. The curriculum reached from accounting and auditing, business and management to social skills. To train the students to handle cultural differences between them and the tourists, the lecturer David Blanton developed the so-called Mapato program. Mapato is short for Multimedia Analysis of Problems in African Tourism, and of course the Swahili word for gains or reward. And it featured 4 main lessons to make the students aware of their own social and cultural background and how to deal with different types of tourists. This program aided Africanization insofar by teaching the students about the history of African travel, deconstructing the idea that tourism and travel had started with colonialism or European exploration. Next slide, please. Ironically, the director and heads of every department at Kenya Utalii College in the beginning, the people who trained Kenyans to take over the tourist industry were all foreign experts, most of them from Switzerland. But the college had outlined its own Africanization policy, which was completed by 1983. You can see here on the slide how the number of Swiss experts and teachers was slowly phased out and more Kenyans phased in on the left side. And on the right side, these are all the specific positions at which time and interval period one of the foreign experts had to go and one of the Kenyan experts had to come in. And I think Kenneth can attribute that as a former director of Utalii, that college was fully Africanized in the mid-1980s. Around 10 to 15% of students at Kenya Utalii College came from other African countries and were funded through scholarships by their own governments, the Swiss embassy, and several German development foundations. In this way, the Kenyan government tried to support the development of tourism and Africanization of tourist industries in other African countries as well. As the first students left Kenya Utalii College after 1977, the industry was at first hesitant to hire the graduates due to their inexperience with this new school system. In a letter to the Daily Nation, a group of students complained in 1977 that no one would give them a job, although they had graduated with good grades. In March 1978, the then permanent secretary of the Ministry of Tourism, Judah Kamora, pleaded with the Mombasa and Coast Tourist Association to give students an opportunity, quoting, "Let me boldly say that unless people are given a challenge, they will never be managers, and I do not think that simple arguments of long experience are enough to justify a slowdown of Kenyanizing the management of the industry," quote end. The quarrels of at least a part of the tourist industry with the new college continued into the 1980s. In 1982, the Kenya Associations of Hotel Keeper and Caterers complained to the college that standards of graduates would be falling annually and the personal conduct of students would sometimes not be satisfactory. I'm quoting again from a meeting from this association. "Students taken on by hoteliers were troublemakers and had little self-discipline. They were always querying orders and knew little about wines and sauces. Their personal conduct was also criticized. Some blame was placed on the instructors, many of whom were appointed too soon after graduation with little knowledge or experience of the outside world, it was felt." End of quote. These issues with the graduates seemed not to have been the case for every employer and student. James Awiti, who I have interviewed, graduated with a degree in front office management in 1979, and both the Hilton Hotel here in Nairobi and the Severance Sea Lodge I have mentioned in the beginning offered him a job. Victor Shitaka and Tuva Mavunga, who both attended Kenya Utalii College in the mid-1980s in the hotel management course, were hired instantly after the graduation by the Sarova and the Serena Hotel Corporation, respectively. The initial resistance against the graduates from KUC lowered as more and more tourists, more and more graduates of them ventured into the industry and pioneered various positions. Shem Migot Athola, who worked at the Institute of Developmental Studies here at the University of Nairobi, was tasked by Tourist Consult in 1982 to work on a study concerning the impact of tourism along the coast. And he explained the slow speed of Africanization with three factors. There was a persisting racial bias against African Kenyans. That's the first one. Second one, it would take trainees and new people in the industry natural time to climb up hierarchies and gain experiences. And there was a different logic, at least multinational corporations concerned had with posting managers. For multinational corporations, they would always, he explained, keep expats in decisive positions to represent their international interests locally. Next slide, please. These statements have brought me already to my last point. How did the tourist industry react, cooperate, resist Africanization efforts? My findings on these issues are preliminary and, of course, cannot be attributed to every business or corporation in Kenya. If we look on the side of the tourist associations, such as the Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers, as representative organizations or lobby organization, if you want to, of the industry, you simply do not find them talking much about Africanization in the documentation I have available. They had regularly sharp and strong-worded communication with tourism representatives of the government, which were much more centered on pressuring the government to intensify promotion, to construct new and upgrade existing infrastructure, to solve electricity and water shortages, and mediate in disagreements with unions. If commenting on Africanization or Kenyanization, like this example here on the screen, these associations did not oppose Africanization in general, but expressed their desire for a moderate and well-planned measures. Whereas the representative bodies were majorly passive, I would call it passive about the issue, individual corporations handled it differently. Block hotels, although regularly being criticized for being the face of a white and colonial industry, just weeks after independence had offered Kenyans to buy shares in the company. This, of course, was not available for the majority of Kenyans due to the lack of capital, but wealthier Kenyans like J.M. Kariuki had bought shares. The Block Hotels, as a Kenyan hotel corporation, implemented itself a rigorous training program for all his employees, even before the Kenya Utalii College was established. Steve Mutua and Stanley Marenge, both former Block employees who I've interviewed, both attested they felt they were being very well trained and rose through the ranks, becoming assistant ministers at the height of their careers and even promoting and representing Block Hotels internationally. Richard Kimeni had joined Block Hotels in 1975 as food and beverage manager at the Outspan in the Aberdares. After several posts in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, the Kikorok Lodge, the New Stanley Hotel or Nyali Beach Hotel, he became the first Black general managers of the Norfolk in 1983. The promotion and installation of African Kenyan managers after they had achieved a certain level of expertise followed a logical business pattern for Block Hotels as a Kenyan-based company. There was simply no need to keep expatriates or foreign experts, as they would not need some form of international representation. The second example, the Severin Sea Lodge, a family-owned hotel, kept a European management until the 2010s. In 1978, the family hired lawyer Sam Varuhio as a partner, as they were afraid the hotel might be expropriated at some time and hoped his connections would spare them from harm. In the 1992 anniversary statement, the lodge owners wrote that the management of the lodge would remain European for 3 reasons. First, guests would need a manager able to converse with them in German. Secondly, the majority of guests would simply not accept an African as a counterpart. And thirdly, skilled labor would still be very hard to find in Kenya. Nonetheless, the hotel had appointed Javan Wabili to the level of a residential manager in 1989, making him number 2 behind the general manager. The company equally hired a lot of personnel trained at Kenya Utalii College. The third example, the African Safari Club, the world's leading organizer of travel to Kenya in the 80s and 90s, developed a rather notorious reputation in Kenya. Although the company was big in size and infrastructure and revenue, it sparked controversy for not providing health insurance to their African employees and for establishing an intense hire and fire system. The largest tour and hotel corporation in Kenya, the African Safari Club, never had an African general manager in its history until its bankruptcy in the early 2000s. The whole management, heads of department, and a large proportion of their office employees were comprised of German and Swiss expats. Furthermore, through their vertically integrated business model, they did not cooperate with other Kenyan enterprises in the tourist industry, and disproportionately little of their money ended up as foreign exchange in Kenya. This business model and the openly racist policies in a few hotels which did not allow Black people to enter the premises were only possible as they had a powerful political backing. President Moi at the time owned several of the hotels managed by the African Safari Club. Again, in her 1982 study, Rosemary Yomo concluded that the work of such organizations like the Kenya Tourist Development Corporations and the Africanization policies had in a number of cases been harmed by corruption and interests of politicians and government officials. I'm quoting from her study. Finally, more examples have been underlined of the manipulation of state institutions for the interest of the ruling class, in that KTDC's construction of large modern hotels was found to coincide with respective tourism ministers and other influential leaders' home areas, and not necessarily with financial viability criteria. Besides Moi, several other government members and influential civil servants owned hotels and held shares in the tourist industry. Already in 1971, Elijah Mwangwale attacked both assistant ministers of the Wildlife and Tourism Ministry in the National Assembly of serving their own interests, as J.M. Kariuki owned Castle Hotel and had shares in block hotels. And Jan Mohammed, the other assistant minister, had owned shares in businesses Elijah Mwangwale was not yet able to fully determine, and therefore praised him for being crafty in hiding them. In 1984, the then Minister of Tourism, Maina Wanjigi, was accused of trying to buy the Blue Marlin Hotel in Malindi together with members of the Italian mafia. While most of these cases are very clandestine and hard to be proven, the economic activities of people like J.M. Kariuki or Kenneth Matiba in the private sector, meanwhile they were chairman of the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation, offered opportunities for obscure business practices. I'm coming to the conclusion. Let me come to the conclusion and a preliminary evaluation of the effectiveness of these Africanization policies I have mentioned. By the mid-1980s, the conversation about Africanization had markedly slowed down. The fourth National Development Plan stated that there had been remarkable progress in this field, and the replacement for expats with Kenyan employees was nearing its end. This and subsequent development plans barely mentioned the Africanization efforts in the tourist industry anymore, whereas the promotion of domestic tourism took a much bigger focus. Many government officials were frequently stated that Africanization in this industry had progressed well. In an article in The Standard in 1983, again, the minister Waina Wanjigi stated that he was optimistic that the tourist industry would soon be fully Kenyanized. And on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the KTDC, President Moi praised its achievements, being especially proud of its achievements in the Kenyanization of the industry. Such statements, of course, do not give us a precise analysis or stand of the Kenyanization, but attribute to it being no longer a major component of tourism policies. Already in 1979, this is the one you can see now, Tourist Consult had repeated part of its initial service from 1968 and found that numbers of Kenyans of African descent among general managers had risen from 0 to 42% in the upper management sector, from 13 to 84% in the middle management sector, and 89% of all heads of departments in hotels were now African Kenyan. Expatriates largely remained as chefs and in technical departments. Another German economist at the time, Jörg Schneider, stated that the old species of colonial managers, which had been colonial officers or farmers, were nearly extinct. By numbers, it looked like Africanization had been a success. Within 10 years, the KTDC had set up a strong public tourism sector and held lucrative investments in several large companies. The Kenya Utalii College had trained more than 1,600 students until 1979, among them 122 for management positions. A big number of these hotel management graduates were absorbed in the public sector and worked for African tours and hotels. The number of expatriate and foreign managers was comparatively small in this public sector, while expat managers were still much more present in the international tourist hotels. African Kenyan managers, therefore, much more represented the domestic tourism sector. As I have outlined, the approach of Africanization and Kenyanization of employees differed within various hotels and tour companies. Multinational corporations often could ignore Africanization policies or simply didn't care and posted members from their country. Local corporations like Block Hotels, Serena, Saroba, or Kenneth Matiba's Alliance Hotels all trained their Kenyan staff regularly and promoted them after sufficient expertise had gathered to appropriate positions. Coming to the very end. We started with the, can go to the last slide, yeah. We started with the Sovereign Sea Lodge in Mombasa, and let me end with it. I have already introduced you to James Awiti, who graduated from Utalii College in 1979 and started as a front office manager at the Sovereign Sea Lodge in the same year. He remained nearly 40 years with the company and worked his way up to head receptionist, front office manager, sales and bed manager before becoming the general manager in 2015. He described himself in the interview as having an eagerness to learn throughout his life. I am mentioning this because these men and women like James Awiti I have interviewed can certainly be regarded as pioneers who fought their way up in what was not only a stress and volatile industry, but one which had and in some parts has not given equal opportunity to everyone. While Africanization policies and institutions certainly did their part, African Kenyan individuals certainly showed immense endurance and durability to make this happen. I would have liked to talk a little bit more about these individual stories, but I have not completed all my interviews, so this has to wait for another day. But the final chapter will hopefully include more of these individual stories, challenges, experiences, and engagements with Africanization. Thank you for the attention. I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I think we have learned a lot from your presentation, Tourism for Wananchi. And I was just listening to your examples. You really gave very good examples. You mentioned Diani, and today Diani is one of the pillars of the coast where most of the tourists go to. And I was actually wondering, why has Matthias not mentioned Severin Sea Lodge? But then I see him mentioning. And that's so interesting because I'll tell you in a while why I was interested in that particular example. Tourism growth, in fact, it is so nice to see that after independence, after the Africanization of tourism, that Kenya's tourist industry started to grow. Of course, you did not look at the previous before independence, but since the time of independence, since Jomo Kenyatta's time to Moi, to Kibaki, we've seen tourism increasing, which is so positive. The appreciation of the tourist industry is just awesome because the Kenyan grandfathers of independence who insisted that this industry must become a Kenyan thing. They had a vision, they had a mission, which we even see in the Vision 2030 plan. So their dreams is what we have achieved, we are achieving, and we will continue achieving. And this, I will just add something from my understanding, is actually helping the country achieve the sustainable development goals. Again, from the tourism industry, by making it localized, revenue has increased. If we look at the statistics, it has brought in a lot of money because Matthias started by telling us that agriculture is the #1 revenue, with tourism being #2. So it has really trickled in a lot of foreign exchange as well as a lot of local money also, because today we have lots of local tourists. And what has actually caused the local tourists to increase is actually Kenyanization or Africanization of the tourist industry. If our leaders did not encourage that, maybe today it would have been a different thing altogether. And something very interesting, we started the tourist industry must have been there before the colonial masters. It's not even must, it was there. Because when the Arabs came to East Africa, they were so impressed seeing the wildlife that they started taking the rhino horns, the ivory. That is tourism. They started taking the local people as part of slave trade. I mean, why I'm saying the local people as slave trade? Because if you look at Maasais, people come to see the Maasais. It's cultural tourism. That's what I'm trying to say, that in the Arab days, that's how they started it, but in a different negative version. But here now we bring it in a positive way. And the Africanization, of course, from the colonial masters, the multinational companies, then the Africans, that is the Kenyans. We started also having public-private partnerships. And again, we are going back to multinationals. But Matthias emphasized that, sorry, that the tourism industry, when we said Africanization, most of the owners were mainly politicians. And that's something really interesting. Why? Because, again, they saw where the business is. And that is what we have to learn, that if we want to take businesses to greater heights, we need to have a vision and mission, that where can we expand for the betterment of the local people. He's mentioned about the tourism boards. You mentioned quite many boards, and that's something very interesting. The setup and role of Utalii College, it's amazing because Utalii College is actually one of the best in Africa. Mwalimu Obongi, you've been the head there. We were once there for a workshop, and it was just amazing. It was the first time I actually saw it. And I was really impressed with Utalii. And the name itself speaks a lot. There's something also Matthias actually mentioned, that in the past, all managers were not locals. Look at it today. Today, most of these managerial positions are under the Kenyans, which is such a proud moment for this prestigious country. And I will tell you why. I mentioned the Severin C. Lodge. I'll go back to it, I'll tell you. It is under the number 2 local manager that it had got an award for the best hotel in terms of environmental standards. So this is so impressive. I mean, it is always underestimated that multinationals or colonial masters or the Europeans can do better things. But anyone, for that matter of fact, given an opportunity, can bring things to a greater height. And this is seen in the tourist industry, as Matthias has explained. Our great ministers brought in policy changes which have helped tourism become African. The same thing goes to our farms, to our businesses, as well as languages. He mentioned about other languages, but I will specify that in European countries, many people are keen in learning Kiswahili because they want to come here and learn about the tourist industry specifically. So they actually learned Kiswahili so they can communicate better, which is a very good asset to us. The role of Switzerland, we appreciate that this culture of helping Kenya make the industry shine out came from Switzerland. Yes, I know, especially the sweet dishes, most of the in the cookery area are Swiss orientated. It is very sad to see that even after the graduates studied at Utalii, they were denied the opportunity to work in the hotel industry until a solid discussion was held up. Mathias reflects on the racial bias, he reflects on the hierarchy of positions and the role of multinational companies. After bringing home Africanization, things have become so positive. Infrastructure development, water, electricity, level of education, employment, poverty reduction, and culture has been uplifted. I never knew one thing. You talked about Norfolk having the first black manager, Kaimeni, which is so nice because Norfolk had been one of the best hotels in this country. It's very sad also to learn from your discussion about Mount Kenya Safari Club not providing health insurance. Yes, that is again open racial or racist policy. I remember once, every Sunday, we used to walk to town with my late dad. And after walking to town, going to Uhuru Park, usually the stopover would be Boulevard Hotel or Norfolk, just to go and see inside. Of course, you couldn't afford a cup of tea, it was too expensive. He took us to Mount Kenya Safari Club. To our utter disappointment. Utter disappointment. He was asked, "Are you a member?" "It is only for members." It was so sad. And that, when Matthias mentioned that, I keep on recalling, even when we have UN conferences there, it makes me remind. It reminds me about that. So, Matthias, thank you so much for all that. I really, really appreciate what you have shared with us. Just wanted to ask you one thing. Is it the Africanization of the tourist industry which brought home Kenya Airways? When did Kenya Airways actually develop? Was it the result of the Africanization and just a thing of interest? Maybe it may not have been part of your study, but I was reading it this morning only in one of the old People's Daily about the Safari Rally. It was started and mainly for the Europeans. Today, there are only 4 to 5 Europeans who participate. So how can we connect it with the tourism in this country? And I heard very little about the wildlife. Something maybe to do with why the national parks and reserves were set up. What role did the non-Africanization play there, and what role did the Africanization then of the tourism industry played later after 1966?
Yeah, thank you for your comments and the questions. Maybe first, because you mentioned the Severin Sea Lodge. Again, they had their 50th anniversary in 2022. So if you go to Mombasa, they actually now have a small museum about the history of their hotel. Helped them a little bit to set it up. That was the deal. I was allowed to look into every material the owner had stored in his house in Germany since 1972. So if you go there, there's actually a small museum, and I would credit them that they have also been critical about their own history. We have set up also a display of how Kenyan history aligned with the development of the lodge. So if you are in Mombasa and go to Maburi, maybe go by there. Yeah, maybe another comment on something you've said concerning Switzerland, the Kenya Utalii College. I think it is important to note, I don't think Switzerland did give Kenya a lot of development aid for tourism just because they were nice. They were looking, of course, developmental aid is very often and very strongly connected to making business. And the correlation that the biggest hotel company in Kenya was a Swiss company with African Safari Club, and one of the biggest tour operators, Kuoni, from Switzerland, regularly sent tourists to Kenya. So by helping Kenya to grow trained and skilled experts, business came back to Switzerland. I think this is very, very important that we know that. Concerning the two questions you had, I think Kenya Airways and the Safari Rally are a bit of a different story. Kenya Airways essentially was built up and set up after the first East African Union fell apart in 1977. And then the East African Airways was split up into 3 different airways: Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. This is actually a really decisive year for tourism as well. Before that, 1977, most of the tourism, a lot of Americans came to do big tours around all of East Africa. And then the border was closed between Kenya and Tanzania. And part of that reason why Tanzania decided to close the border, because usually tourists would come to Nairobi and then go for book a safari tour, and then would go maybe for 1 or 2 days into Tanzania and come back to Kenya. So that means they would use the Kenyan tour operator. They would sleep most often in Kenyan hotels. So only a portion of the business actually ended up in Kenya. This was part of there were many reasons why Kenya and Tanzania had quite an intense relationship at that time, but tourism was a big part of it, because a lot of Tanzanians representatives felt they were cheated out of the business as they did not have enough revenue. And they actually built the Kilimanjaro airport to get tourists directly to Tanzania. But the whole Ujamaa socialist system in Tanzania is again another topic which had a really intense and different relationship to tourism. Wildlife and conservation, of course, is essential for tourism. You may have found that I'm talking about it more in another chapter. Maybe you have also find me not talking so much about it, because I think just from the available material I can access the beach tourism a little bit better, and how the hotels especially related to Africanization efforts. And it's also caused, I think this time between the late 1960s and 1990s was a very different time with the relationship. Beach tourism was much bigger then, even as it is today. And this safari tourism was big as well comparatively to all over Africa, but it was at times it was 1/3 or 1/4 even of all tourism in Kenya. So this is why the focus sometimes is much more on beach tourism. You have to say it like this, Kenya's beach tourist sector actually broke down in the late 1990s as a result of the Likoni clashes and Kaya Bombo. The numbers in 1 year dropped from 400,000 to 150,000. So the huge business was lost there. And the numbers actually just in 2013-14 reached the same numbers. So for 20 years, Kenya's beach tourism sector was really down. This is why I've been talking a bit more about beach tourism than wildlife and conservation, also because I just have more material concerning that sector. One sector where it was much easier for Kenyan operators or for Kenyan entrepreneurs starting out in tourism was very small safari firms. So it was quite common. I've interviewed a few people who've just started with 1 car and then gradually built up their company. I have interviewed a guy, an Indian gentleman in Mombasa. He bought himself a small office opposite the Castle Hotel in Mombasa, which was by then the biggest and most frequented hotel. And he would just get walk-in clients, as he had a big sign for his safari firm. And he was one of those people starting with one car. And I think 2016, 17, he kind of closed down. He had 50 cars. So he gradually progressed throughout the years. And tour operators were easier because you had a very low investment in the beginning, of course, than compared to setting up a hotel, which usually required a lot of capital. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthias. We will take questions from the floor, please. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Matthias. Thanks for your presentation. One is a comment, the other one is related to that as a question. I think I want to support Dr. Perita on the idea of tourism before what you're calling tourism. It appears tourism is associated with the white man. And I think you need to demystify that in your project paper or in your dissertation. How do we consider tourism only as a white man's business? And two, when you talk of Africanization and Kenyanization, why Africanization and Kenyanization when based on my earlier question, when there should have been tourism existing in Kenya? So can you find other concepts to explain your work beyond these overplayed Africanization and Kenyanization concepts? I think we need to move away from that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of the questions. Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll collect it.
Thank you very much, presenter. I came a bit late, but I'm happy, and I think I'm so much elated of your presentation. I just have one observation to make. I am one of those who teach a tourism course in this university, and I've had the opportunity to take students out to major tourist attractions in Kenya. And one thing that I have noted together with my colleagues and even the students is that there isn't much actually Africanization that has been done as far as tourism is concerned. If you look at it from the perspective of, national parks and the reserves, whenever we go to the national parks, it appears like there is a form of segregation that takes place there. And there is preference that is given to international tourists vis-a-vis local tourists. For instance, if you take University of Nairobi students to Safo, for example, National Park, I'm just giving an example. The first thing that you are asked there is that what is the age distribution of these students? If your student is above the age of 23, then that student will have to pay more than one who is at the age of 22. So we are wondering, and I keep on wondering, what connection is there between age and visitation to these parks we are talking about? So for me, I think that yes, we have Africans working in these parks in the form of human beings. They are there, but there is colonial mentality in them that has failed to escape. And if you look at the history of national parks and the ordinances over time, you'll see that national parks were actually set to cater for the whites or for the colonials. So we haven't actually run away from that colonial mentality. So the issue of Africanization is still far far-fetched. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mathias, for the presentation. Again, probably my colleagues have preempted me what I wanted to ask. But my concern is, I was wondering that in your presentation, you are putting it that colonialism is responsible for the origin, growth, and development of tourism in Kenya. When you look at probably before the advent of colonialism, people used to visit relatives, they used to visit friends, and as an aspect of domestic travel. But you find that the statistical data was not captured, but there was an aspect of travel, meaning that people would travel even, or they were traveling before colonialism. The other one is not a question, but probably maybe an observation. Mathias, you have told us that the Kenyan government has really supported the tourism by coming up with training centers, for example, the Utalii College. Apart from training, I thought that the Kenyan government has also done a lot in terms of coming up or supporting ecotourism, or coming up with ecotourism societies in Kenya, whereby this is tourism that is friendly to the environment, and it entails conserving the same environment. I thought that the government is still in the front line in advocating for that. Again, the government has also been being a stakeholder in the field of tourism, has ushered in the local communities, or they have brought the local communities on board, where they have felt that the ownership of tourism as a product, for them to be able to promote it promote it in the near future. And I agree with my colleague that the aspect of Africanization of tourism in Kenya has not really been achieved, because when you walk aloud and ask people or the local communities, have you ever traveled? Quite a number have not maybe gone beyond the town within their household. They just know the local village. They have not traveled, because most people feel that tourism is an expensive endeavor, and it is probably a product of the rich. And for them, simply because they don't have money to travel, tourism is not meant for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we take more questions, Mathias will answer this many. But before you answer, based on what Madam said, I had that point. It's just I missed out. You know, you say tourism for Wananchi. So is it the colonial masters who have actually created tourism for Wananchi? Where is by Wananchi? Because Wananchi have also been responsible. In our own country, we are responsible for tourism, not outsiders who developed it.
Yeah, thank you for all these questions. I should have brought my very first subchapter to discuss, because this is actually on all of this question: when did tourism start, or who initiated tourism, who implemented tourism? And this whole first subchapter is actually a discussion about it, where I would agree with all of what you said and try to deconstruct this idea that tourism is a Western idea, a Western concept, or that the idea of leisure came with Europeans to Kenya, which is quite a wild idea. It is, I think, I'm writing there again the established state of research, because I would say the established state of research on tourism history actually said that tourism was invented in Europe and then diffused during colonialism all over the world. And I'm actually calling my first chapter is called Co-producing Modern Tourism in Kenya, where I would say this is a project that Kenyans, our East Africans and Europeans together set up this industry. You just have to think about the term safari. The safari is the Kiswahili word just for travel. And it was today, in many ways, it has been reduced to a form of leisure travel. Most people in the world would associate it with the idea of leisure travel. So I think, and I have quite a few bits in my first chapter about traveling and before colonialism in East Africa, about hospitality, about in East Africa. There was, I mean, the whole of the East African caravan trade, when the explorers, the European so-called explorers came, they just used this established system of long distance mobility here, which was run and fabricated by Africans, and they were just very dependent users who had to pay huge sums to use that way. And then I think what we were talking about is basically an effect of colonialism, because then you had an oppressive, dominant colonial system who took over travel and privileged it towards white people. The railways, all of the Kenyan economy was geared towards extracting resources, and travel and tourism was one field of that. And of course, this diffused into how we today think about travel and tourism. And if you find quite a few hotels in Kenya have, or tour operations or national parks, if you read the little booklets they have about the history, they all state this started with colonialism, which of course is wrong. And I hope you will all read my very first chapter on that, which is trying to deconstruct that. I think when we're talking about what I've said about Africanization and Kenyanization, this then is the reaction, a part of the reaction of the Kenyan government and a few other stakeholders to correct this, to correct a tourist industry that was dominated by white Kenyans or foreigners, to bring it back towards Wananchi. And I would actually say that the phrase that I have, tourism for Wananchi, in the title is actually something that the Kenyan government stated. So they were trying to enable, it wasn't white colonialism offering tourism to Wananchi, but the Kenyan government trying to reclaim tourism. And I would agree with what you have said. I don't know your name, about the national parks. There's a Kenyan ecologist, I've just forgotten his name, who basically says, why are African countries doing conservation? He says that critically, because they're doing conservation to offer African wildlife so that white people could go and enjoy it. And this is the whole problem with the system of conservation. It's completely geared towards tourism again. This is the connection that was made in the 1950s, and that in another chapter, I'm trying to show how that was implemented and how it actually impacted heavily the lives of the people that lived there, the lands got alienated, that Kenyan Africans were not able to afford going to a national park at many times, either because of the fees or either because they couldn't afford the transport to go there. Yes, your last point, I would totally agree that Africanization or Kenyanization of the tourist industry has not been achieved. I would say that in many ways the Kenyan government gave up on that idea sometime in the late 1980s, 90s. There were still measures and rules and regulations trying to change that, and the KTDC and Utalii College still exist and trying to do that in some purpose, but it's not with as much effort, I would say, than it was some now 30 years ago. Ecotourism, again, I think a very different concept. I would say came up in Kenya in the 1990s. That's where it started, and in the beginning, I would say there were quite a lot of good ideas of how ecotourism or tourism in general can benefit local communities. There are a few projects, I would say, that are worthwhile, but I would also say this has not been done properly or set up as so much as that local communities would benefit on a large scale. Otherwise, a lot of tourist areas in this country, I think, would look differently. Yeah, maybe so far.
Mwalimu there, please.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm just wondering, following what my senior said here, do you think the coming of Europeans really helped in Africanization of tourism, or it barred Africans from tourism? And why I'm asking this is because the Europeans come, particularly the British in this country, and gazette some areas and say these are national parks. And what captures my interest is in those parks were worshiping places for Africans, where our shrines or the Africans' shrines were. And these guys say, no, you don't need to step here. First of all, stop worshiping your gods and your God and worship ours. These shrines are backward and everything. Then they gazette the same areas, and now they are visiting the same areas without the knowledge of Africans. If you went to Savo East and asked the management, they will tell you that one of the problems we have is the Akamba and the Taita want to access the park to worship and do their sacrifices. But then the KWS people who have a colonial mentality are saying, no, you can't afford, you can't access this. The same happens to Mount Elgon National Park, which is sacred for the Sabaot, the Bukusu, and other people who live there, but they are told, don't go there. But the same Europeans now are going there to see the same shrines that they told the Africans not to do. So do you think this aspect of colonial, did it promote tourism, or it killed African tourism, introduced theirs, then later on told us that follow us in ours, but we can also go and see your shrines? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathias. Talking about things I'm somehow very familiar with after spending about 8 years of my life in this industry. Let me make just a few comments and raise one or two questions. Now, it's very clear from your presentation that the whole notions of Africanization, there is a way in which they fed into the general categories that racially denigrated Africans in a sense. And I think that is important. And you can see, as you hear my colleagues on this on-site audience saying, there are traces of that even up to our time. Of course, I'm bound by, the confidentiality code that I signed as a CEO of Utalii, but at some point, if you go to the institution and see how it was set up, you see that very, very clearly. You made a tour of that institution, and on the upper side of Thika Road, there are staff quarters there. And behind the college, there are also staff quarters there. In the 60s and the 70s, the expatriate staff lived in the houses behind the college, and the place was called senior staff quarters. Now, across the road on the upper side, near Survey, that is where the Africans lived, and the place is called Utalii Village. Implicit in that is the whole notion that Africans never quite get out of villages. Even when they are in town, they are still in villages. If you look at the socio-geography of Nairobi, particularly during the colonial era, everywhere that African lived were called villages. Ziwani village, Muturwa village, Shaulimoyo village, where the rest of the races lived, qualified to be estates. Probably those are things that you need to explore more, that even in our own time, there is a tendency to give more priority to, let's say, animals than the lives of Africans. You know, 1 or 2 lions are killed by Maasai Morans somewhere either in Amboseli or in the Mara. The Minister of Tourism flies there with a helicopter and very senior officers from KWS and perhaps the Inspector General of Police. And you see them meeting around carcasses of lions. Normally that does not happen when the same lions kill the Maasai Morans. Perhaps we need to rethink our paradigm of conservation. Then number 2 is the very interesting intersection of Africanization and Kenyan politics. People who are key in our political landscape, they became key in being investors in the industry. Perhaps you might want to explore that more. And then you realize probably what you are calling Africanization was only Africanization by getting a few hands to do fairly many work in hotels. But the real people who mattered were the political elites and their, European friends who owned these hotel facilities. Maybe that is something you need to look into. But if I may get a little bit more academic, I listened to you in terms of your methodology. You seem to me to oscillate between ethnography and content analysis from documents, records from the archives, from private reservoirs and all that. But I was at a loss as to how you are going to deal with the issues of historical objectivity, because I was impressed by the liberal nature with which, for example, you highlighted the names of the people you have interviewed. How then do you deal with the situations where you have to say things that are fairly objective, but they may not necessarily, speak to the garel generally? That's my only worry when it comes to your methodology. Then maybe you might want to comment on that. Number 2, your analysis, seems to me to speak very well and in tandem with literatures that tell us that what we had in post-colonial Kenya is really a fundamental continuation of what was happening in colonial modernity, insofar as tourism is concerned. So would you say then that when you look at post-colonial modernity with regard to tourism, all these notions of Africanization and African directorships in some hotels, which sometimes are tokenish in nature, it speaks more to the notions of not yet independence, or what Jaramogi Oginga called not yet uhuru. Thank you.
You can answer those questions, then we go online.
Yeah, is it on? Yeah, thank you again for these comments and questions. All very important and insightful. Again, with your question, I would completely agree that conservation and national parks are a continuation of both colonial thought and practice. It is, there was I think it was 19, don't let me say something wrong, 1952, the so-called Arusha Wildlife Conference, where essentially it was becoming clear, no, it was 1959, sorry, where it was essentially becoming clear that Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and other countries in the area would soon become independent. And international conservationist organization from the United States, from Great Britain, put a lot of money and effort into convincing the new African leadership that conservation would be the way to go. And they did this by enticing them with tourism. They basically said, tourism will give you so much money. This is why conservation is worthwhile. And this is the reason why I think tourism is partly responsible for why so many rites and traditions, you mentioned sacred religious sites of people in what became game reserves and national parks were simply ignored by both the colonial authorities, but also the early post-colonial governments. This is why these anti-poaching campaigns, which you had in regular intervals in Kenyan history, were so radical against local people who did subsistence hunting or who hunted professionally and commercially. And it tilted all this idea of conservation towards radical action. I mean, the KWS is if you want to call it, it's essentially a paramilitary organization, weaponized to defend animals against people. And what Kenneth said, this notion of animal rights before people's rights is quite often, I wouldn't say directly stated, but indirectly in all of these magazines. And I have mentioned from the tourist industry, like the Safari magazine, who was widely, or the magazine Swara of the East African Wildlife Society, they're heavily in these times arguing against poaching and pro-animal rights and pushing people's or the rights of the communities to live there aside. So it's very much a colonial structure and colonial continuity in thought continuing. Thank you, Kenneth, for all of your comments, especially that the difference between the senior staff quarters and Utalii village. That is a very good example again of that. Concerning tourism as a lucrative sector where different senior officials or just powerful Kenyans invested in, I think this very much mirrors agriculture, where you have the same, say a similar story. I would say that after independence, a lot of wealthy people would be able to buy these big farms of Europeans, and as tourism was essentially the number two in the economy, this happened with a lot of hotels as well. It is also, I think, the reason why this Diani research complex I have explained did not come to work, because a lot of politicians in that had stakes or already built hotels in that area or had bought land to build hotels on, and a general master plan essentially destroyed their plans. So this is why the findings of this study that was done were presented in 1975 and 76 quite a lot, and then this project just completely went silent. And in 1979, the president, then President Moi, just discarded it in favor of individuals and private enterprises who would develop this. I would still say this is coming also to your questions of methodology, why I'm connecting both ethnography or interviews with the material or the more written basis. One reason for that is because I'm trying to fill gaps from both sides within the material. And also because I think, at least to some regard, after doing 15 to 20 interviews with various people who were the beneficiaries of these Africanization policies or went to Utalii, I think in some way they attribute to at least to personal successes of the Africanization processes. And I'm just trying to combine how these general patterns impacted individual lives or careers or biographies and vice versa. So I haven't written the whole methodology section yet, but I find it there's quite a few, I would say, books concerning tourism history that are written in this way now, because the material is so fragmentary, but also because I want to bring it down from a very general policy to what it meant to the individual lives of people in that industry.
Okay, we go to the online comments and questions. Most people are saying it's a good presentation, and I will go back to our colleague, Molimukule. If you can explain the circumstances that led to the collapse of AT&H and what happened to the assets, and what is the relation between the collapse of AT&H and the Africanization of Kenya's tourism and tourism hospitality sectors. Please be as brief as possible.
I don't know much about that. I've interviewed someone last week who worked for African tourism hotels for 20 years. He told me the company was closed in the early 2000s due to a decision of the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife, and the assets were sold to various stakeholders, private, and some went back to the Kenya Tourist Development Corporation. So this is what happened. I don't know the specific circumstances. He told me there was definitely some interest of individuals making profit out of that. Yeah.
Then from Fidelis, our PhD student Fidelis, who says it's an impressive discussion and refers to how the Africans occupy the upper and middle class managerial positions. And the question is in relation to that: did Africans appropriate this expansion of tourism at lower or local levels? In which ways, which we can talk of wage employees in the tourism industry? Fidelis, I'm not getting that question very clearly myself. Can you unmute yourself and ask Fidelis, please? Self, please ask now.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Fidelis?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes, please go.
All right. My question is, we have seen that Africans were able to occupy upper and middle management positions in these hotels. And my question is, did Africans appropriate this Africanization of tourist industry at lower levels or at local levels, especially in the cultural tourism, in ways which you can talk of African wage employees in the cultural tourism industry? I am having in mind of the group of dancers especially women dancers who performed in these tourist safaris, and sometimes went to international festivals in places like Algeria, Yugoslavia, West Germany in the 1969 and 1970s. Did this performance amount to what we can call African labor at that level in cultural tourism industry? And if so, what were labor relations? How did they appropriate these opportunities in terms of, or in the sector of cultural tourism? Yes.
So from what I've understood, the question is about the lower and middle management position, as you would call it, and even other positions. I think I've said this in the beginning at some point, 98% of these positions were already filled with African Kenyans in the colonial era and thereafter as well. There was one reason why tourism was flourished actually, or was because there was always a huge amount of readily available cheap labor in Kenya, and until today. This is why this system so far has worked, and I would say most of the hotels and tour operators were simply dependent on that cheap labor, and therefore filled this lower and middle management position much quicker. Concerning the questions of the dances you have mentioned, just one example, the Bomas of Kenya, which I think you will know, were set up sometimes in the mid-1970s, and they had a group of dancers which would tour the world actually to attract people for tourism in Kenya. So this is just one example.
We go down. Move. Okay, let's take a question from Professor Simiyu, please. The tourism, he has a suggestion, he's giving a comment. In his opinion, the tourist industry may have been Africanized in terms of human resource, but everything else remains foreign. Look at, for example, how pricey the services are. They all are beyond the pockets of the locals, and that's the comments which other colleagues also give. And then the last question from Molimu Kule. To what extent do local communities own or control tourism service provision in the counties? And what are your views on what can be done to Africanize tourism enterprise in the counties? Please be brief.
I think I'm just answering these two ones together. This is again the study of the Kenyan lady Rosemary Yomo, which is already from the 1980s, but she essentially, I think, makes a good argument that this is not, that the whole idea of Africanization and tourism is not only a question of let's say race or nationality, but also a question of class. There is quite, today, the domestic sector in tourism is the biggest tourism sector in Kenya. So there's more people, more Kenyans traveling and spending their holidays at the beach. Then there's actually international people coming in, and it's Kenya's middle and upper class who can afford that to do so. And I would, as a historian, I think I would not try to propose any measures on how Africanization can be achieved today. That is something I am not trained for. I have a few suggestions I can offer privately, but I don't think this should be on the recording.
Okay, thank you. Anybody online who would like to ask or comment? All right. So it looks like everybody has asked or commented. So Mathias, we are grateful to you for the presentation and the knowledge you shared with us, and we appreciate it. So colleagues, students, thank you very much for being there, both physically and online. We really appreciate. And may I request Mwalimu Obongi to say a few words?
A lot has been said in this Nairobi evening. Mine is first to thank you, Mathias. You know, you've done a good job. Looks like you've done quite a lot of work in your interviews and picking data from many documents. And I can say as a PhD supervisor that your battle is almost half won. So thank you very much for agreeing to come and share this with us and for being part of this conversation in our department of upcoming research and areas of interest. This is a new area you have opened up, and the MA and PhD students in our department, both in history and archaeology, I'm sure from now onwards we'll be interested to explore some possibilities of doing something on some lines that touch on tourism. So thank you very much. Secondly, I just want to extend our very sincere thanks to our colleague and very good friend of mine, Dr. Parita Shah from our Department of Geography, Population and Environmental Studies. Doc, thank you so much. I know you are quite busy with the Innovation Week that is going on, but it's a great honor for you to have found time to come and moderate and discuss this afternoon. As you can see, the interest is growing, and perhaps one of these fine days I should invite you to come and supervise one of our students who will do a theme that is probably beyond us as historians, conventional, political, social, and cultural historians. So I'm sure we will come back to you. To the colleagues who have been here, Mwalimu Ngesa, Mwalimu Tabitha, Mwalimu Masika, Mwalimu Nyanchoga, our students who have been online and on-site, thank you very much also. And I will not forget to thank some of my former colleagues from Utalii. I saw a couple of them online, and including one who said hi to you in Germany. Actually, that's a lecturer in the Department of Languages. I don't know whether you met her. Okay, yes. So I'm very glad that they were able to attend. And the rest of the people outside the country who attended, I saw one or two who attended from abroad. Thank you very much for being part of us and being part of this conversation. We'll see you in 2 weeks when we will be doing our last topic for this semester. And I can see the presenter is already here, Madam Tabitha. Madam Tabitha, we are looking up to what you're going to say in 2 weeks. And until then, thank you and God bless you.